Steve McQueen, he became a race car driver. Well, he died fairly young, too, right?
50.
Smoking and drinking.
Steve McQueen was a Hollywood legend, known for his love for speed. But his life was more complicated than it seemed. Behind the fame, Steve faced personal battles, troubled relationships, a difficult childhood, and a quest for peace. As he navigated these challenges, his health began to decline, leading to his untimely death in 1980. What really happened during those final moments? Did the public ever learn the full story? This is the death of Steve McQueen as they never told you. The final moments of Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen had always been larger than life, the kind of man whose name made people stop and listen. But on November 3rd, 1980, he was barely recognizable. He had asked evangelist Billy Graham to come see him. Something was different about Steve. He was waiting for surgery that, if successful, might save his life. But deep down, maybe he knew the odds. Graham came to see him just before Steve was to be flown out for the operation. When Graham arrived, he found a shell of the bold actor people knew. Steve was confined to his bed, an oxygen mask strapped over his face. Graham observed that Steve's eyes still had that spark, but his body was worn down, the toll of years of fame and lifestyle catching up. Lying there, Steve shared everything. He talked about his regrets, his mistakes, and the way his life had shifted. He said he found a new hope in God, how it gave him peace. Steve had lost his Bible somewhere along the way, so Graham, without hesitating, took out his own. He wrote something inside, handed it to Steve, and stayed by his side, praying for the man who had once seemed untouchable. 4 days later, Steve passed away. He was just 50 years old, and when they found him, Graham's Bible was resting on his chest, as if it had been the last thing he reached for. But what brought Steve here, to this fragile moment, hanging on the edge? To understand, we have to go way back to the very beginning, before fame took its toll, before things spiraled. A tough childhood. Steve McQueen lived for speed and for racing. It wasn't just a hobby, it was in his blood. From rough off-road motorbike races to long, tough endurance competitions, he did it all. If you looked closely at his life, you could see where his love for thrills came from. His father, William McQueen, had one of the wildest jobs you could imagine. William flew stunt planes in a flying circus. He performed daring tricks high up in the sky in an old biplane. It's no wonder Steve grew up craving the same rush of adrenaline. But that's pretty much all William gave his son. After a short romance with Steve's mom, Julia, he left. He took off, leaving her alone and pregnant with Steve. Julia was only 20 at the time and wasn't ready to be a mother. She struggled with drinking and had a bad habit of picking violent men. Sadly, Steve was often caught in the middle of her messy life. He wasn't her first priority, and the choices she made would haunt him. Still, there was a bright spot. In 1933, when Steve was 3 years old, Julia sent him to live with his grandparents in Missouri, and for a while, his life seemed to get better. Steve found some peace living in the small town of Slater, Missouri. It was the first time he felt like he had a home. His grandparents took care of him in ways his mother never could. They gave him a sense of stability. For a little boy who had mostly known chaos, it felt like a fresh start. Things finally seemed to be going well. But then, something unexpected happened. Journey through trouble. By 1938, Steve McQueen's life took a sharp turn. His mother, Julia, had remarried, and this time, things only got worse. She pulled Steve out of the peaceful farm life he had with his grandparents and moved him to Indianapolis. It was a harsh change. School was a struggle for him. He had trouble reading because of dyslexia. He also couldn't hear well due to an ear infection as a child. But school wasn't the worst part. At home, Julia's new husband had a violent temper. He often took it out on Steve, beating him whenever he felt like it. It got so bad that, at just 9 years old, Steve decided he had enough. He ran away and left the safety of his home to live on the streets of Indianapolis. One day, he was a kid enjoying life on a farm. The next, he was out there on his own, trying to survive. It didn't take long for Steve to get mixed up with a street gang. While most kids his age were playing after school or doing homework, Steve was roaming the streets and getting into trouble. Small crimes here and there. Nothing huge, but enough to put him on a bad path. His mom wasn't around much, but even she saw where her son was heading. Realizing Steve was on the road to jail, Julia knew something had to be done. But in typical fashion, she didn't want to deal with it herself. It had worked before, so Julia tried again. She sent Steve back to Missouri, hoping the quiet life would settle him down. For a while, it worked. Steve felt relief being back in the country with his family. But peace didn't last long. When Steve turned 12, Julia's second marriage fell apart. She decided to move to Los Angeles for a fresh start and dragged Steve along. Maybe this time things would get better, right? Wrong. Julia quickly remarried, and just like before, her new husband wasn't much of a father figure. From the moment Steve met his new stepfather, they despised each other. The man had a violent streak, much like the last one, and he didn't just take it out on Steve, he hit Julia too. The constant abuse pushed Steve back into a cycle of rebellion. He started getting into trouble again, acting out like before. Julia, overwhelmed once more, decided to send Steve back to live with family in Slater, Missouri. But this time, something had changed. The streets had toughened Steve. Life in the country wasn't enough to calm him anymore. Missouri felt too small, too slow. So, at 14, Steve made a bold decision. He snuck away from his great-uncle's farm one night without a word, not even a goodbye. Maybe he felt inspired by stories of his father's wild life. Whatever it was, Steve craved adventure, and he found it quickly. He joined a circus for a bit, but the life of a rodeo clown or performer didn't suit him. That stint didn't last long. Soon, Steve ended up back in Los Angeles, reuniting with his mother and stepfather. But now things were different. Steve wasn't the same boy anymore. He was older, harder, and something darker had begun to grow inside him. The last straw. When Steve McQueen returned to Los Angeles, he went right back into his old ways, and before long, he was getting into trouble again. One day, the police caught him stealing hubcaps. They took him back home, where his stepfather was waiting. As soon as the officers left, the man became furious with Steve. He attacked him, just like he had done many times before. But this time, the beating was different. It ended with Steve being thrown down the stairs. Lying at the bottom, something inside him finally snapped. He looked up at his stepfather. What he said next sent chills through the room. Steve told him that if he ever hit him again, he would kill him. For the first time, his stepfather and mother believed him. The years of tension between them had reached a breaking point, and now Steve wasn't just rebelling. He was dangerous. From that moment, everything changed. Julia didn't know what to do with her son anymore. Sending him back to Missouri wasn't going to fix this. Her husband convinced her to take a more extreme step. Together, they signed court papers declaring Steve incorrigible, legally admitting that they could no longer control him. With that, they sent him away to the California Junior Boys Republic, a school for troubled boys in Chino. It was a place meant for kids like Steve, boys who had lost their way. Though this would be the place where Steve McQueen would eventually find himself, the start of it was far from a fresh beginning. It felt more like a nightmare just beginning to unfold. The transformation. The California Junior Boys Republic was no walk in the park. Life there was tough enough, but for new kids like Steve McQueen, it was worse. As soon as he arrived, the other boys made him their target. He was the outsider, and when he messed up, the teachers punished the whole class, not just him. This only made his classmates angrier, and he ended up getting beaten by them too. At first, the place felt like a prison, but over time, something changed. Steve began to find his place, slowly earning respect. For the first time, he started to feel like he fit in, and it left a mark on him. Though the school was strict, it was exactly what Steve needed. By the time he left at 16, he wasn't the same rebellious kid who had arrived. He was stronger and more focused. And even after he became rich and famous, Steve never forgot what the Boys Republic had done for him. But don't think that meant Steve settled down. In fact, his life was just getting crazier. After leaving the Boys' Republic, he reunited with his mother in Greenwich Village, New York. But city life didn't hold him for long. He met two merchant marines who convinced him to leave it all behind and head out to sea. Before he knew it, Steve was aboard a ship sailing toward the Dominican Republic. Well, if you think joining the merchant marines as a teenager was a wild move, wait until you hear what he did next. Wandering rebel. The sailor life wasn't for Steve McQueen. As soon as he landed in the Dominican Republic, he ditched his post. Instead, he found work at a brothel. This marked the start of a wild bohemian chapter in his life. But Steve never stayed in one place for long. He soon left the brothel behind and made his way back to Texas. There, he worked at a carnival. After that, he wandered up to Canada and became a lumberjack. Steve was never the sort of individual who could be easily tied down. For approximately 2 years, he jumped from one job to another and from country to country. He was constantly restless and always in search of the next adventure. All this happened before he even turned 18. In 1947, despite his free-spirited nature, Steve ended up in the Marines. It seemed like a strange choice for someone like him. But somehow, that's where he landed. He wasn't yet 18, so he needed his mom's permission to enlist. She didn't hesitate, likely seeing the Marines as a better option than having him run the streets. With her approval, Steve headed off to boot camp. At first, Steve seemed to be doing well in the Marines. He even got promoted to private first class. But his rebellious side quickly resurfaced. He couldn't stand being told what to do and got demoted back to private not once, but 7 times. His biggest problem, though, came when he was caught off base with a girlfriend for weeks after his leave had ended. He didn't go quietly when they tried to bring him back, and as a result, he spent 41 days in prison. It was a rough start for McQueen as a Marine, but through the chaos, a different side of him began to emerge. Steve's time in the brig seemed to have changed him, at least a little. After that rough patch, he started to shape up and became a model Marine. The highlight of his time there came during a tough Arctic training exercise. While they were training in the freezing waters, Steve's ship hit a sandbar, and several Marines were thrown into the icy waves. Without hesitating, Steve dove in and pulled 5 men to safety, saving their lives before the cold could take them. Maybe there was more to this rebel than everyone thought. In 1950, he was honorably discharged. Once out of the Marines, Steve drifted through a series of odd jobs. He even worked as a pimp for a time and sold illegal handguns on the side. He didn't seem to have much direction, at least not yet. Then came 1952, and Steve McQueen had tried nearly everything under the sun. But there was one thing he hadn't tried: acting. With money from the GI Bill, he decided to give it a shot. He enrolled in acting classes in New York City. There he studied under well-known teachers like Sanford Meisner and Uta Hagen. Acting opened up a whole new world for Steve. He took to it quickly. However, he had no idea that this was the beginning of something much bigger for him. Steve McQueen's love life and racing career. Steve McQueen's love life was always a hot topic for the tabloids. He was known for jumping from one beautiful actress to another, and it all began when he was just starting out in New York City. Back then, he started dating Gia Scala, a fellow acting student. Scala never quite reached the same level of fame as Steve. However, she appeared in plenty of films during the 1950s and 60s. Their relationship was wild, but it didn't last long. Maybe it was because Scala didn't like how Steve spent his weekends. You see, while the GI Bill helped Steve get started in the Big Apple, it wasn't enough to cover all his expenses. Luckily, Steve had another talent that brought in cash. On weekends, he would race motorcycles to support himself. And naturally, he was good at it. In no time, he was earning around $100 every weekend. Today, that would be like making $1,000 a week. If things had gone differently, Steve might have become a professional racer. But fate had other plans. New York wasn't giving him the opportunities he wanted, so in 1955, Steve packed up and moved to Hollywood. There, everything started to change. Within a year of being in Los Angeles, he met and married actress Neely Adams. She was stunning, and their relationship seemed like a perfect match. They went on to have 2 children together. Their marriage started out blissfully, but it wouldn't last. Eventually, things would fall apart in the worst way possible. For now, though, Steve was riding high. He had a family, and his acting career was finally starting to take off. Hollywood breakthrough. Steve McQueen's move to Hollywood turned things around for him. Before long, he scored his first lead role. It was in a low-budget sci-fi film called The Blob. That movie gave Steve something important: attention. And that attention led him to a new opportunity, a role in a Western TV pilot. The show was called Wanted, Dead, or Alive. Steve played a bounty hunter named Josh Randall. It was the kind of tough, no-nonsense character that fit him perfectly. Audiences loved it, and he became a household name. But that was just the beginning for him. With Wanted, Dead, or Alive making him a star, McQueen's career really started to take off. Soon, he was landing roles in big movies like The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape. It had taken him years of struggle, but Steve had officially arrived in Hollywood. Now, anyone who worked with him could tell you right away that Steve wasn't like the others. He didn't just do what was expected. Steve became known for films where he got to drive fast cars or ride motorcycles. Most actors would leave the dangerous driving to stunt doubles, but that wasn't Steve. The directors quickly realized something. Steve could drive or ride better than the professional stuntmen. So, instead of stepping aside, Steve took the wheel himself and performed many of his stunts on his own. But Steve's career was about to get even more intense. A career-defining classic and its costly journey. In 1968, Steve McQueen landed the role that would define his career. It was in a movie titled Bullet, a tough San Francisco cop in a sleek Mustang racing through the city's winding streets in one of the most thrilling car chases ever filmed. It sounded perfect. But behind the scenes, things were anything but smooth. Director Peter Yates had a reputation for perfectionism. And Steve? Well, he was just as demanding. Together, they pushed Bullet way over budget. Warner Brothers was horrified. They had signed Steve to a massive contract that promised 7 more films. But after this, they were done. Before the movie even hit theaters, they pulled the plug, canceling the deal. It seemed like a disaster. But the studio had no idea just how wrong they were. Yes, Bullet went over budget, but when it hit theaters, it became an instant classic. Critics loved it. Audiences loved it even more. The movie made 10 times what it cost to make, and it became one of the biggest hits of the year. Warner Brothers quickly realized their mistake. They tried to fix things by offering Steve another contract, but it was too late. Steve didn't want to work with them anymore. Bullet marked the high point of Steve's career. The film had made him an icon. But the thing about reaching the top? There's only one way left to go. And for Steve, the fall was coming faster than anyone expected. Subscribers Pick. Now, it's time for today's Subscribers Pick. In this unique image, we see a striking combination of faces from different eras. Joe Rogan, the famous podcaster, appears deep in conversation, while Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, listens intently with a furrowed brow. Between them, in a scene that seems ripped from an intense movie, we see Steve McQueen, bloody, struggling, and lying on a bed. The scene looks dramatic and haunting, almost as if Rogan and Eastwood are dissecting the moment on Rogan's podcast. This surreal moment brings to mind the death of Steve McQueen as they never told you. It hints at a deeper mystery, perhaps something we have never heard about McQueen's life or the roles he played on screen. Now sometimes, images like this are meant to confuse people or spread falsehoods, but other times, they challenge us to question what we think we know. So, did Rogan and Eastwood have insights about his life, death, or the legacy he left behind? Could there be more to Steve McQueen's story that hasn't been explored? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Steve McQueen's turbulent love life. Steve McQueen seemed to have it all: fame, fortune, and a career on fire. But behind the scenes, his marriage was crumbling. He and Neela, his wife of over 15 years, were drifting apart. The final blow came after she had an abortion in 1971. The distance between them grew wider, and soon, Steve found comfort elsewhere. That elsewhere was on set, with actress Ali MacGraw. The chemistry between them was hard to miss. They were pulled towards each other like moths to a flame. However, one big issue stood in their way. Both were married. MacGraw's marriage, much like Steve's, was in trouble. This made everything even messier. Despite all these, it didn't take long for them to start an affair. But in Hollywood, secrets rarely stay buried. Neela soon learned the truth, and that was it. It wasn't just Steve's marriage ending, though. MacGraw's relationship was also shattered. The two of them didn't waste any time. Within a year, they divorced their spouses and married each other. They thought they had found something real which was going to last. But this marriage was different. It burned hotter and burned out faster. And just as quickly as it started, things were about to take a turn. And it was one that no one saw coming. People often said that Ali MacGraw was the love of Steve's life. But their relationship was far from smooth. MacGraw once said there were moments with him that felt wonderful, while others were nearly unbearable. Steve had a temper and could be difficult to live with. And so, their marriage was filled with highs and lows. As if that wasn't enough, something tragic happened. During their whirlwind marriage, Ali MacGraw suffered a miscarriage. It was a deeply painful experience that served to push their relationship even further toward the brink. Their strong connection wasn't enough to hold them together. In 1978, after just a few years, they decided to part ways. The marriage ended, but their story still lingered in people's minds because of the passion they had for each other. But Steve didn't like being on his own, and it didn't take long before he found himself in another situation. Now, most people go through breakups by meeting new people the usual way, through friends, bars, or even just by chance. But Steve had a unique method. Right after splitting from MacGraw, he saw someone who caught his eye. It wasn't someone he met in person, but a woman he spotted in an advertisement. Most people would probably think nothing of it, but Steve McQueen wasn't like most people. He had his agent do the work of tracking down the woman from the advert. Her name was Barbara Minty, a model who had no idea that the famous actor had his sights set on her. McQueen's bold move led to the two of them meeting, and soon they were a couple. It wasn't long before Steve and Minty took things further. She became his third wife. Things seemed to be falling into place again for him. But little did they know that life had other plans. From the spotlight to solitude. In the mid-70s, when Steve McQueen was one of the biggest stars on the planet, he suddenly stepped away from it all. He stopped making movies, disappeared from the public eye, and spent his time traveling across the country in a motorhome. Everywhere he went, he would race motorcycles. But there might have been more to his decision to leave Hollywood behind. Steve had his share of dark secrets. With a career full of ups and downs and a rocky love life, it wasn't shocking that Steve struggled with addiction. By the 1970s, he was near rock bottom. He smoked nonstop and drank heavily, indulging in the hard-partying lifestyle that came with being a star. Even at the peak of his fame, Steve had some strange demands. Whenever he agreed to do a movie, he would ask for things that seemed random. Boxes of electric razors, stacks of jeans, and bulk supplies of simple items. People couldn't understand why he, a Hollywood megastar, would want these things. The real reason was far from selfish. Steve never forgot the boarding school he went to as a troubled teen. Despite the rough start, the place had become like home to him. He wanted to give back. All those items from his bizarre movie contracts? He donated them to the school, making sure the students had what they needed. Sometimes he would even visit, playing pool with the kids and sharing stories from his wild life. Steve had a violent past, many messy relationships, and battled addiction. But beneath all that, there was a man with a heart. A man who hadn't forgotten where he came from. Still, Steve's story was far from over. And what came next would change everything. Spiritual awakening and tragic diagnosis. After stepping away from the spotlight, Steve McQueen found himself living quietly in Santa Paula with his third wife, Barbara Minty. He had a new passion, flying. He bought a yellow Stearman biplane and quickly learned to fly, just as he had mastered motor racing. His instructor, Sammy Mason, was a man in his early 60s. The two became close friends, spending hours in the air together, talking about life. Steve sensed something different about Sammy and was curious about what it was. One day, he couldn't help but ask him directly. Mason calmly shared his secret. He said his peace and joy came from his faith in Jesus Christ. Following this, Steve began attending Ventura Missionary Church with Mason and his family. However, around that same time, McQueen's health began to decline. He developed a persistent cough that failed to go away. At first, he blamed it on his heavy smoking. Even after he quit, the cough lingered. Doctors tried antibiotics, but nothing worked. When Steve finally went in for a biopsy, the news was something no one expected. He had pleural mesothelioma, a rare form of lung cancer. But it wasn't just the cancer that was tragic. It was how he got it. Steve's illness was caused by exposure to asbestos. This was a material used in ships during his time in the Marines and even on film sets. The asbestos was in soundproofing materials and the protective suits he wore while racing. Unknowingly, McQueen had been breathing in this deadly substance for most of his life. A star's last stand. Steve McQueen tried to keep his illness a secret, but soon the news got out. The media found out, and everyone knew he had terminal cancer. Fans from everywhere showed their support, but no one could change what was happening. His cancer was aggressive. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do. But Steve wasn't the type to give up easily. When American doctors lost hope, Steve began searching for help elsewhere. This search led him to a man named William Donald Kelly, who claimed he could cure cancer. Desperate for an answer, Steve turned to him, even though Kelly's treatments were untraditional and risky. Kelly wasn't actually a real doctor. He had been an orthodontist, but his medical license had been revoked. Still, Steve felt he had no other option. Kelly promised a cure, but what followed was a nightmare. The treatments Steve received were strange and uncomfortable. Every day he got injections of cells from cows and sheep. He had coffee enemas, endless massages, and was given a so-called miracle drug called Letril. Despite all this, none of it worked. And worse yet, Kelly charged Steve $40,000 a month for these painful, useless treatments. The sad reality was that Kelly was a fraud, preying on Steve's desperation. In October 1980, Steve made one last trip to Mexico. By then, a massive tumor, 5 pounds in size, had grown on his liver. His American doctors had told him there was no hope. The tumor was too large to take out, and Steve was not strong enough for surgery. The doctors told him his heart wouldn't handle the operation, but Steve wasn't willing to give up. Under the name Samuel Shepard, Steve checked into a small clinic in Juarez, Mexico. The doctors there didn't know who he really was. It wouldn't have mattered anyway. Despite his efforts, Steve's body had reached its limit. On November 7, 1980, at 3:45 a.m., Steve McQueen passed away from heart failure after his surgery. He was only 50 years old. In the end, the cancer was unstoppable, just like the doctors had said. But one thing was clear. Steve McQueen had fought until the very end. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.